All right, welcome everyone to a new episode of the Zero to Play podcast. I'm your host, Carl Leduc, and today I'm joined by Sam Barham. Sam is the chief monkey at Balancing Monkey Games, an indie studio in Dunedin, New Zealand that created Before We Leave, a cozy, mostly non-violent city building game. Today, we're going to talk about his journey into game development, the ups and downs of developing and releasing Before We Leave, and exploring some of the questions behind games as a form of art and how they can impact our future for the better. So sit back, relax, and enjoy episode 3 of season 2 of the Zero to Play podcast. Okay, thanks for joining me today, Sam. I really appreciate it.
No worries. I wanted the music to keep going. It was cool music.
Yeah, no, so season 2, I've added a new intro and it hypes me up every time. So I have to play it leading into it, and I love it.
Yeah.
Hopefully I won't get sick of it too quick. So yeah, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate you coming on and giving your time. There's a ton of questions that I have, and I kind of want to jump around a little bit. And I just want to start off by talking about how Before We Leave is a non-violent game. And I think the word non-violent has a lot of backstory, just violence in games these days. And I just want to hear a bit about the reasoning behind why non-violent is part of the kind of tagline for Before We Leave.
Partly, so I'm a Christian, and as a Christian, I didn't want to create a violent game. Partly, to be perfectly honest, it just evolved like that. It was like I was making this game, and I was thinking about the games that it's based on, the games that inspired it, and what I like and don't like. And like it's heavily based on the NO games, NO 1404 in particular. And the one that I don't like about that game is when you have to go and fight people.
Yeah.
And so I was like, why tack this thing on that the game doesn't need? And it kind of went from there.
Yeah, I love it. And I personally, I feel like there's a trend in gaming at the moment where studios are really trying to push for different kinds of experiences that aren't about violence. It's kind of an easy win in a lot of ways. And I think for gaming to mature as a medium, there needs to be more games that don't focus on violence. And I think Before We Leave is a perfect example of that. And I think it's a perfect game to kind of represent the gaming industry in a lot of ways for what is possible. So yeah, I've loved doing research into Before We Leave, and I'm definitely gonna pick it up and play it. I haven't really played city builder type games, but this seems like a nice introduction into the genre. Is that how you describe it, as kind of a lightweight version, or does it get quite complex as you get further into the game?
It's a lot simpler than some of them. It does get complex. There can be a lot going on and a lot to think about and monitor and all that. But yeah, it is in some ways kind of a bit of a light version of city builders.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I had a question about just kind of on the same theme of non-violence and avoiding violence in games. How did you make sure that the game was fun? Because I think violence is something that's used as like an easy way to kind of get the blood boiling and the heart racing. How did you intentionally make sure that Before We Leave was fun when developing it?
It was definitely a challenge and something I struggled with a bit. I think, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not 100% convinced that we hit the mark on making it, take out the violence and add something else to make it still fun. But it was mostly just about thinking about, and to be perfectly honest, I was making this game for me. This is a game that I wanted to play. So it was thinking about what do I enjoy in these games, and trying to replicate that. So it's about the complexity of laying out things. It's about seeing your little ant farm of people going around doing jobs. it's about advancing and growing, and so you just concentrate on those things instead.
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to come from when it comes to developing a game, is just making a game that seems fun to you. Did you see the process of making Before We Leave similar to the days when you played Anno? Did you find that making the game was fun as well in that process, or would you say it's a completely different experience than playing a game?
It's completely different to playing a game. I've said it before several times. The creative journey sucks sometimes. There were days. So a lot of the development I was working at home by myself, and a lot of the days were great, and I really loved what I was doing, and it was an awesome time. And some days I get halfway through the day and be like, I just want to give up and stop and go and get a day job. Can I please stop doing this? But yes, it's nothing like playing games. No.
Totally. No, and I think it's really important. I'm glad that you said that, because it is, I mean, even a 9 to 5, has those periods of being enjoyable and then being laborious. And I think that's just a part of any, you can't just be enjoying life 100% of the time every day. I wanted to touch on something. So you've contracted people to come help you in. I know you brought in a second programmer to help you out, and some artists. I've noticed out of like the 5 people that you've contracted, a community manager is one of them. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's really interesting, just in terms of the gaming industry in these days. I feel like 10 years ago, a community manager wouldn't have been one of the top 5 people that you would contract. And I think that just speaks on the climate of Twitch and Discord and managing communities and an indie project these days, and what is kind of required. I'd love you to speak a bit about why you brought Emily on as a community manager, and what value she's bringing to the game at this stage, so early on.
Just one point there. So Isaac, that programmer, and Emily, they're now employees, not contractors.
That's awesome.
Valuable enough that we brought them on properly. It all boils down to some advice that I got, that I've talked about a bunch of times, was that, so it used to be back in the day, you're fighting off dinosaurs on your way to work, that being in the press, being in the right magazines that was it. That was how you sold a game, was to be in the right magazines. And they kind of don't really matter anymore. And then it was, websites, news websites. And similarly, in terms of selling your game and making it a success, they kind of don't matter anymore. They matter some. And then it was streamers and YouTubers. You had to be getting played by the big streamers, and that was how you made your game a success. And these days, it's building a community around your game. And that is, and streamers and stuff, they still matter. They're still a big influence, but a bigger influence is building a community. And so I got that advice relatively early on, which I was very grateful for. So it meant that, for example, when we first publicly announced the game, I already had a Discord server set up with an idle game on it, so people could come along and have something to do in order to make them stick around and build that community. And it meant that I can't remember if I was looking for a community manager or if I just saw Emily saying, or someone mentioning her saying there's this community manager looking for work, and I was like, there we go. But yeah, having someone on board to do that part. And also, I mean, as any business should, you think about, what are we good at, what are we bad at, who do we need to find? And I was doing my best to grow this community, but I wasn't awesome at it, and bring someone in who can do it better than me.
Yeah, and I saw the test stream that Emily did on Twitch a few days ago, and I think that's a really interesting, just next chapter of community management. Sharing the development and just kind of putting content out there. I think that'd be really interesting. One thing I want to ask you more about is, you mentioned you had an idle game in the Discord server when people arrived. Can you speak a bit more about that? Because I think that's something that not a lot of people are aware of, or see, or kind of understand how important that was when people entered into the community.
Yeah. So again, it was, I've done all of this stuff just because I get advice or hear advice or read a whatever that says you should do this, and so I do. So I was lucky enough to get to go to GDC in San Francisco in 2019. What is time anymore? And there was a talk by Mike Rose who was talking about exactly that. What do they do to build their community, to build their Discord servers to make them good? And he talked about the Discord server for the game Descenders. And in their case, what it was is as soon as you go to the Discord server, most of the channels are locked. You can't see them. You have to pick a team. No context. You don't know why you're picking a team. As soon as you do, channels are unlocked, including some team-specific ones. And then they would constantly have events of making fan art or throwing shade at the other teams, or competitions between the teams, all sorts of things like that. And it all is about building that community. So people come along to a Discord server and it's like, okay, you can talk about the game that's not out yet, that we have no details on, then going to last about 10 seconds. Whereas if you turn up and there's a thing to do, there's a reason to come back, then that's huge. So that's exactly what I did. I found a guy, again, just someone posted on Twitter or something, and I was like, that sounds like right what I need. So I found this guy who was really good at making Discord bots, and got him to make a ongoing idle game that it was kind of a little bit like what Before We Leave is going to be, but of course it was early days, so it was just kind of making stuff up. And yeah, went from there. And it's still running and people still play it.
That sounds really interesting. So games of the future have to launch with another mini game that's developed within the community. That's kind of where I see it as like an interim concept that would be interesting to the same audience that the actual game will cater to as well.
And I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be another game. It can be, it can be anything. The question is just, how do you grow your community? And you think deeply about that and you figure out something and you go from there.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And it's really unique. I think we're going to hear more stories like this about different indie games that have different experiences, and Discord being such a valuable company now for building community. Would that be your rank, just in terms of someone who's launched an indie game? What would you rank your kind of third-party apps in terms of the value that they bring? I know there's a subreddit for Before We Leave. Like, how would you rank the top services that you've used to help build that community?
Yeah, Discord's number one by a long way.
Cool.
And I think Twitter's probably the next best. We've had a lot of decent engagement on Twitter, and then Reddit's great for some games, for some people. It hasn't been particularly wonderful for us. We've got a small community on there, and that's fine. Facebook, we're wondering why we bothered. So yeah, I mean, those are our social platforms where we keep talking about adding in like Instagram and stuff, and it's always like, yes, when we have time.
Yeah.
Never enough hours in the day.
Totally. But yeah, I think what's good about Discord is that it's a private community. It's it's not a strategy to try and get hashtags and to try to get people to find you through that. It's just, you're taking care of your little community that you've
and it means you can be much more deliberate about that. And like, we deliberately wielded a very trigger happy ban hammer. You come into our Discord server and do anything that's going to threaten the community, and you get banned with no warning, because we're entirely uninterested in trying to salvage a community that's gone sour.
Yeah, no, it's cool. I think being good at building a community is another really big skill for indie developers now, to just to research, not necessarily be good at, but just just research, look at GDC talks, hear stories of how other indie developers have done a good job. Yeah, that's really cool. I'd love to take a step back and hear a bit more about your story, because I know you worked in mocap. I grew up, by the way, watching Squirt, and I loved that TV show, and it was so cool to see that you worked on that. And I'd love to just know a bit about your journey, like when you first started programming. Did you play games at the same time as you started learning how to make games? What was your software development journey like?
Oh my gosh, I feel old now. So I played games long before I started learning how to make them. Unless you count, I mean, back in the day on other people's computers that were so old that you had to type the game in. You got the page of code and you typed it in, and there was a game. Yay! My first computer was an Amiga 500. I think my first one of my first memories on that is finally getting the extra 0.5 megabyte module, so I could now play Eye of the Beholder. That was a good day. So I mean, I've played games since I was early teenager, and went to uni, did a computer science degree. I mean, I've always sort of tinkered with making stuff, just as, occasional hobbies. I've got some time on my hands, so I'll try making something. And they always fail because I wasn't really into it that much.
Yeah.
So my career, I worked at Animation Research Limited, which you may know from things like the America's Cup and stuff like that. So yeah, I was the motion capture and animator on Squirt. Was my first job. My hand has been on the Squirt TV show. I handed something in from the side of the screen. Other than that, that was it for me. And then the cricket software was my sort of main thing for several years, traveling around the country, operating that and building that. Eventually realized that live TV was not the place for me. It's an interesting beastie. So then I went and worked at a company called Straylight Studios for a couple of years. So there we were making games. It was work for hire pretty much for other companies. Unfortunately, the global financial crisis came along and killed that. And so then I pretty much ended up at a place called AD Instruments. I've worked at ARL and ADI, and I keep getting them mixed up. So AD Instruments is it's a life sciences research and education company. So I was working on the education product. Wound up being their DevOps architect for quite a while. And then I went off to another similar place, Education Perfect, doing similar stuff, back-end programming and so on. And by that time, I was making balls before we leave as a hobby, and entered it into Kiwi Game Starter and got funding, and that kind of rolled from there. So yeah, I've been a programmer for 22 years in terms of my professional career, 25, 26 if you count uni. But yeah, just done all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, I'd love to ask you a bit about, so with your experience in live TV and working in motion capture, there's some interesting things happening in gaming now in that space, and I'm just curious if you're aware of that, if that's still kind of an interest of yours. No. Right, because yeah, like there's like live TV, for example, esports, I think are starting to adopt just like new ways of engaging the audience, and things like that. And there was that Nickelodeon Super Bowl. There was like a augmented Nickelodeon branded
cool.
Like it was like rugby mixed with or it was NFL, I think, mixed with Nickelodeon and SpongeBob, and it was just a weird experience. And I wanted to know if that's something like, because I think there's a lot of innovation happening in that space. But so yeah, that was my question: is do you are you aware of all these things, and do you have ideas of how things might look in the future as mocap becomes, easier and cheaper? And
no, that's ancient history. I mean, as I say, I really enjoyed working at Animation Research, and it was a great place to work, and I loved it. But yeah, live TV and me weren't weren't a great mix.
Yeah.
It's very, very seat of your pants, and long hours away from your family if you're traveling around for sports events and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Totally.
And I mean, it's certainly an area that's growing, and it's got all kinds of amazing possibilities, especially with the internet being more and more accessible and more powerful, and technology going crazy places that poor old fuddy-duddies like me can't handle anymore. I mean, my parents are often like, oh, we've got no idea what you're doing, we don't understand it. And I'm kind of experiencing that with my kids now.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? It's just technology is advancing so much that it's beyond like a generational gap. It's like a yearly gap now. If you're not in the know and if you're not keeping up to date, then things just slip by. I think there's just gonna be so many things to do with technology that we won't understand, that it will be impossible to understand everything about, how self-driving cars work and, that kind of thing. There's, we just kind of have to accept technology is gonna just make things easier, and we just have to adopt it, which is an interesting thing to come to terms with. I have a few questions that are more to do with before we leave.
Cool.
Because I work in production, I'm always interested, and I love asking these kinds of questions to other game developers, and that's how did you manage, especially with Before We Leave, which has like a tech tree that gets complicated as you get further. How did you manage the assets and the like documentation? Was there anything in particular that you did or overcame to make that process smoother and easier for the team?
I wish there was, but I just kind of made it up as I was going.
Yeah.
I mean, because I was solo developer for most of the project. So Isaac came in as second programmer about 6 months before release. And so at that point, the game was largely set in stone. And I mean, bringing him in was amazing because he's got a fine arts degree in photography. And so his first day working with me, he was like, if we tweak the exposure, it's going to look so much better. And I went, I know some of those words. But yeah, I mean, because I was solo developer, and because I'd already been a developer for 20 years, I was able to just kind of do it and keep it all in my head. Which in some ways now I regret, because I mean, certainly any new projects we're going to document better and have a game design document, or be able to communicate all that stuff and make those decisions before we stick them in code and they're locked in stone. But nah, I mean, it was all just making it up as I go along.
Totally. And I mean, production isn't really needed until you've got a team that's, maybe bigger than a dozen people where conversations, you can't be a part of every conversation that happens. So that makes total sense. I feel bad for my career now that community managers are more sought after from small studios than production are. So I just have to come to terms with that.
I saw a tweet a while ago basically saying most indie developers don't hire producers soon enough.
Yeah.
And that's very much on our minds at the moment as well.
Yeah, you guys are at that tipping point. Like you said, for your next project, you want to make sure that there's documentation and things like that. And yeah, I think especially if you're having those conversations now, there's probably value in taking notes during those meetings and things. But that's cool. That's really interesting. I appreciate you sharing some thoughts on that. One thing that I've heard you speak about when talking about Before We Leave is how well, I don't know if it was specifically to do with Before We Leave, but just games being a form of art. And this is kind of a question that I like to ask every guest, and that's just, do you think that games are a form of art, or do you think that they're just a way to kind of have fun and I guess distract you from, like, I don't know, I guess that the word art has many layers to it, but do you think games are art is the question?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, what that means is a very large question. You can go, games are art, done, easy. I don't know much about history, but my understanding of history is, I mean, what games are now, classical music used to be. And before that, paintings used to be. They were a commercial reality. They weren't just done for the pure artistry of it. And so, yeah, I mean, games are art, but they're also fun and a distraction and a commercial, entity, and all those combined. I don't really see the point in trying to make distinctions or draw lines or say they are this and not that.
Yeah. I think the nature of games is what makes it a hard conversation to have, because the nature of a game is you make choices, and it's action based, and that can be very much aligned with real life in a lot of ways, and that's what a lot of the things that I feel like we're seeing is companies adopting game design tactics to kind of gamify their companies. And it's not as simple as a painting to look at. It's an experience that you have to have and go through, and storytelling in games is different as well. I noticed that you sourced a lot of the kind of the lore behind Before We Leave, and I just want to ask you about storytelling. Was storytelling something that you were very conscious of throughout the development of Before We Leave? Is that something you really wanted to do well, is tell a powerful story?
No, I think part of making games, especially as an indie developer, is you have to recognize what you're good at and what you're bad at. And the stuff that you're good at, you need to capitalize on and work out how you're going to do more of it. And the stuff you're bad at, you either need to recognize that you have to do it anyway, and either do it anyway or find someone to do it for you, or you need to go, okay, we're bad at that, we're just not going to do it. So apart from there's sort of an implied story, and I guess you could say it's an implied story because I didn't see myself as a storyteller. So I didn't want to try and build a story into the game because I didn't feel I could do a good job of it. I mean, maybe I would have, I don't know. So there's when you're playing the game, there's this implied story of what happened and what's happening and stuff. But partly as a Discord community growth thing, we decided that we wanted to write the backstory, the story of why things are the way they are at the start of the game. So we brought in Saf Davidson as our writer to write the backstory. And so, as I say, it was partly a community growth thing. The idea was that she writes a chapter, and then there's a choice, and the community gets to make that choice, and then we write the next chapter. And after a while, that kind of wasn't really lighting things on fire, so we just went ahead and wrote the rest of it. But it was still pretty cool thing to do. And then we went, people outside of the Discord community need to see this, so we built it into the game. And yeah, as a thing that you can sort of discover as you're playing.
Yeah, no, that's cool. And I love seeing different examples of how storytelling is done in different games, and it doesn't have to be this, big overarching life lesson. It could just be something that adds a bit of flavor and a bit of color to a cool environment, and that's what I love most about Before We Leave, is just the hexagonal view, like the shapes and the just the overall art style is so pleasing to look at. I didn't want to end this podcast without saying that, because that's one thing I admire the most about it, and that's just from looking at the trailers and looking at gameplay footage, and it's not even experiencing the game yet. Yeah, so I heard you speak about how if you weren't a game developer, you would be a builder, and this made me think about some really interesting questions about just building. And so do you still kind of stick by that message that you love the idea of building and creating something from scratch?
Yeah, I mean, I've always made plastic models and played Warhammer and War Machine and games like that. And I'm currently I was just this Easter I finished building a fence to keep the chickens out of a piece of our backyard so that we can turn it into like a relaxation garden.
Yeah.
I've never like built anything proper. Like my stepfather built his own house. I've never done anything even close to that. But yeah, I've always loved creating things. I've made a working clock out of paper. I built a paper model of Optimus Prime that was about 4 feet tall.
That's awesome.
So I've always liked making things, and even though it's digital rather than physical, that's what I see making games as. It's just making this thing, and I think that's why there's that sort of tactile nature to Before We Leave. It looks like something you could touch. That was deliberate. I wanted it to be even more than it is. I wanted it to look like it was an actual physical thing that just happened to be behind your computer screen.
Cool.
And I mean, to a certain degree, that was not a realistic thing to do on my skills and budget. But it's still something that we kind of aimed for, that it felt, it should feel like this real thing.
Yeah, this brings up an interesting conversation that you kind of touched on. So, creating something digitally versus creating something physically are two very different things. And I'd just love to ask you how you feel about, like, so if you were to build a house from scratch, like you said your father did, and then if you were to build something in, say, Minecraft, I don't know, if you were to put as much time and effort into building a house in Minecraft as you would in real life, would you see those two things as equally as fulfilling? Because there's this question about, can games replace physical activities, and if they can bring that kind of physical pleasure through a digital environment. And that's just the question that I thought I'd ask you, is building a house, like you said, you in Warhammer, do you see those as comparable tasks to work on?
The first thing I thought of while you were talking was, oh my gosh, I hope not.
Yeah.
The physical and the digital are different, and I think they should remain different. Personally, I don't like the idea of them merging. But I mean, if you and I guess it's because their basic realities are so different. With physical things, whether it's a model or a house or whatever, you've got the laws of physics, the realities of materials and strengths, and the ability of the tools that you have to shape them and all that sort of thing, which makes, and also the tactile, the ability to touch it, to hold it, to turn it, to look at it, to feel the surfaces. And that makes the physical, when you've built something physical and you can look at it and you can show other people, that's a very satisfying thing, whether it's a house you live in or a model that you look at or play with or whatever. Whereas the digital is, I love I can't remember who said this, but I keep thinking about it, about the infinite thought stuff. So, computer programming is so different from other engineering disciplines, for example, because instead of making things out of known quantities like steel and concrete and wood, you're making it out of infinite thought stuff.
Yeah.
So you can make anything, and that's both a good thing and a bad thing.
Yeah.
It makes it harder, but it means you can make such amazing things. And I don't for a second think that building something digitally is lesser. I talked about the wonderful things of physical objects, tactility and all that. And achieving something digitally, whether it's in Minecraft or making a game yourself, or I don't know, any number of other building games, or how, making a game in Scratch or whatever. that's just as valuable and just as fulfilling and just as wonderful an achievement. But they are, and the very basic realities that they're built on are entirely different. And so I think there'll always be that difference.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And it's funny because as technology advances and as tools become available, I feel like people are going to try and make things more and more like physical. They'll try and try put the same rules that real life has, whether it's gravity or the cost of materials or the scarcity of location. And I think I feel like people are going to try and make games that are closer and closer to the physical reality, and I think that that's going to make people ask questions even more, like if and I've had a lot of this thought as well, and there's something about community, there's something about being part of the environment that you can't replace digitally, not yet anyway, unless the world just kind of became post-apocalyptic and people lived in underground like they did in Before We Leave, and you kind of have to recreate what the world used to be like. I feel like that might be a scenario where people would adopt a digital virtual world, but with with the ocean and land and like there's just too much beauty out there for it to try be replaced by something digital.
Exactly.
Sorry, I didn't actually plan to go this direction because I didn't have any prepared questions, but I think it's a really interesting thing to talk about and
totally
to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. I'm just going through my questions now. I think it's awesome that your wife is now on as a managing director at Balancing Monkey Games. How do you see the company in a year's time? Are you planning to grow quite a lot for your next project?
I don't know. I'd say quite a lot. We're hoping to grow. We're planning to grow, but I have no interest personally in Balancing Monkey Games being big. The largest company I've ever worked at was maybe 200 people scattered all around the world. I'm imagining we might reach 10. That kind of size. Over time, not soon. But I mean, even now I spend a lot of my time on the stuff that I don't want to be doing. I'm a programmer. I'm a computer programmer. I make software. That's what I want to do. And the bigger the company gets, just by the nature of things, the less I get to do that, and the more I have to do all the other stuff. My title is creative director, and I don't particularly want to be a creative director. I want to be a programmer. But that's the reality of what I'm doing here, what I'm building here, that I have to do all that stuff. So round up off topic. But yes, we're planning on growing. And I mean, apart from anything else, contractors are great, but I'd love to be able to have some of those things that we contracted out in-house. And yeah, we'll just see how we go.
Yeah, I think you have your website is beautiful, by the way. When I was going through it, I saw it was done by Psychoactive in Wellington, if anyone's interested. But the Before We Leave website is beautiful. And
they did a wonderful job.
Yeah, it's so good. And I noticed on there, you guys have your kind of mission statement for the company. And I think you guys are such a wholesome, the game is wholesome and your company is wholesome. And that's what I love is you guys have a mission to kind of give back to your community, to support underrepresented groups. And I think that's awesome. And you come across like that, Sam, as well, as just someone who just cares about following their passion and doing what they love and helping others along the way. And I loved seeing that. The last area that I would love to touch on during this podcast is trying to squeeze out any advice that you have for game developers wanting to make it in the industry. I know you've probably mentioned this a lot, but I'd love to just have it kind of solid and stone in this podcast. But if someone was willing to put a game out and apply for Kiwi Game Starter like you did, what advice would you give leading up to that process? And maybe we could talk about that for a few minutes.
So the advice I've given people a bunch of times before is basically, if you want to make your game as a hobby, go for it. That's great. That's wonderful. Make it as a hobby. Recognize that that's what you're doing. If you want to make games as a business, if you want to make a living off games, then you have to recognize that there's a whole lot of stuff that goes into games that you may not want to do, that you may not be good at. I think one of the biggest defining things in my journey was, at the right time, I encountered things like the Pro Indie Dev Conference, which was an online conference of a bunch of successful indie developers talking about how to be successful, how to make games that were actually going to work, and stuff like that. So, if you want to make a living off games, you have to think about, is this a game that people are actually going to pay money for? Because a lot of people make a game and then don't realize that actually no one's going to pay money for this. You have to think about, how am I going to get the word out to people? Because you have to reach tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people if you want your game to actually make any money. And if you aren't thinking about that from the start, it's not going to work. You hear horror stories from marketing people all the time where someone turns up and says, I've made this game, help me market it. And they're like, sorry, you're 2 years too late. You've already failed. So, that was what I did. And that's what made me reach this point, was I encountered this at the right time. And I went, okay, I am bad at marketing. I will always be bad at marketing. How can I fix that? I am bad at art. I will always be bad at art. How can I get around that? Unity asset packs are great for prototypes. Go find asset packs that are near enough and run with it. That's what I did for the first Kiwi game starter. The game looked like pants because it was all just asset packs, but it was good enough. And I'm never going to be a sound designer. How can I get around that? And you think about those things, and sometimes the answer is, I'm just going to have to get better at it. Until Emily came on board, I could have gone, I'm always going to be terrible at community building. I can't do it. But I was like, I have to, so I did. Whereas art was like asset packs, because there's no way I'm building a 3D model that's worth anything. But yeah, recognize what you're good at, recognize what you're bad at, recognize the things that you have to do anyway, and figure it out somehow. Do the learning, do the work, find friends or whatever.
Do you remember that moment when Before We Leave went from being a hobby to being something that you really tried to market? Was it during the process of applying for Kiwi Game Starter? Do you remember any time in particular?
In terms of trying to market it, it was something I thought about all the way through, because of encountering this advice early enough. Certainly, it didn't sort of become a thing that I was doing until we announced it publicly. But even then, there was a good 3 months where I got very little done on the game, because we spent 3 months. At that point, I'd been able to bring in a guy to help me out with PR and stuff. And 2 or 3 months, a lot of my time was dedicated to just making an announcement video.
Wow.
And I was working on the game at the same time, but not as productively as I might otherwise have been, because that had to nail it, and I knew that, But and that was kind of where the marketing effort started in terms of publicly visible stuff. But marketing, like the marketing before that, is more thinking about, what do people that like this kind of game want? What am I giving them? Am I giving them something that people are going to want to pay money for? Is this feature a good idea in view of the commercial reality? Or am I just wasting my time making something because I feel like it? That kind of thing that's the initial marketing kind of effort.
I just want to ask you before we end the podcast here, did you create any other prototypes before We Leave, or did you tinker around with any other kind of of games that, before we leave ended up becoming the one that you went with?
Yep. So, sorry, I started making games as a hobby because I'd always wanted to make games again. But my wife finished writing her master's thesis, and so I was like, okay, you've been locked away in the study for the last 2 years, writing the thesis. Now it's my turn. So I started working on something that was also a city building game, but I was just starting, building games as a hobby. I was just learning Unity, and I was like, yeah, this is too big. So I gave up on that one. And then I started on another thing. It was going to be kind of like Civilization, but in 30 minutes. And that was where I built the whole spherical tiled planets that assemble as you explore them, and various other bits of technology that turned into the basis of Before We Leave. And I worked on that one for quite a while and had friends playing it. And the response was always, yeah, it's okay. And eventually, again, because of advice I got from somewhere or other, it's like if people aren't going, oh, this is amazing, then you're wasting your time. If you put your game in front of people, especially people who aren't predisposed to give you good feedback, like game developers will try and be nice, and friends and family will try and be nice. So so I was getting this response. I was like, yeah, okay, that's not good enough. It needs to be, this is amazing. And so I gave up on, well, I didn't give up on that one. I pivoted and turned it into what became Before We Leave.
Yeah, that's great advice as well. So I haven't actually heard that yet, but that makes a lot of sense. If you show it to the public and they're not, giving you a very positive reaction, then it's going to be an uphill battle from that point on.
And cool. I mean, there's a balance here. You don't necessarily want to show it to the public, because if you show it to the public and you get a lukewarm reaction, you kind of already failed. It's too late. But whether it's friends that you trust to give you honest feedback or something, you just or you show it to people who are going to give you positive, skew their feedback positive, and then just recognize that and go, if they're telling me that it's great, is it actually great, or are they just being nice? And you just try and filter that and figure out what's being said.
Yeah, it's definitely a subjective thing, and it's part of the process. So thank you so much for coming on. Before We Leave had an epic exclusive launch last year, and this year, once the exclusivity ends, you're launching on Steam, I believe, if I understand correctly. So there's a big Steam launch. So please go and wishlist Before We Leave on Steam, or buy it on Epic Game Store and play it now. Is there any other kind of resource or information or social handles that you'd like to spread to the audience listening, for them to kind of follow your journey?
So our Discord, of course, is a big one. It's discord.gg/Before We Leave. We're at Balancing Monkey Games on Twitter. Those are our two main sort of sharing of our journey. So if you want to follow along, go and follow them, and we'll see you there.
That's awesome. And do you have a Steam launch date?
Yes, so it's launching May the 14th New Zealand time, so May 13th for everyone living in the past.
Awesome.
Yeah.
No, that's great. That's soon as well. Awesome. All the best with that. And thank you so much, Sam, for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
All good. And take care and have a good day.
You too.
See ya.
See ya.